The wind of 1879 had teeth, and it chewed on the silence of dry willow with a relentless, grating sound. It was a high, lonesome sound, the kind that scraped dust from the cracked earth and flung it against warped wooden walls. It found the loose nail on the undertaker's sign and made it sing a single, shivering note. It pushed its way through the gaps in the church steeple, but it could find no voice there. The great bronze bell hung dumb and heavy, a voiceless giant in the dark. Its rope, thick as a man's wrist, had been severed years ago, cut clean through with a saw or an axe. The townspeople said it was to keep the peace, to let the dust settle on old sorrows. But the quiet it left behind wasn't peace. It was a held breath, a tension in the air as palpable as the coming frost. The silence was a ruler, and Dry Willow obeyed. Out of the vast, ink-black desert to the west, a rider emerged, not as a sudden appearance, but as a slow coagulation of the shadows. He was a piece of the night that had detached itself and taken the shape of a man on a horse. The horse, a tough, dust-colored Mustang, moved with the weary patience of an animal that had measured the last 100 miles in heartbeats. Its head was low, its breath pluming white in the sudden chill that fell with the last of the light. The man on its back, Cole Harrow, sat the saddle as if he'd been born to it, a seamless extension of the leather and the beast. His long duster, the color of the red rock canyons he'd just left, was stiff with grime and travel. His hat was pulled low, its brim casting his face in a perpetual twilight. In a holster strapped to his thigh, the wooden grip of a Colt peacemaker was smooth and dark, but it was the other instrument he carried that defined him in that moment. Tucked into his belt was a simple harmonica, its metal tarnished, its reeds choked with the same dust that covered him. It was a tool for making noise, for filling the emptiness, but it lay as silent as the church bell, at the eastern edge of town, where the trail bled into the main street. A circle of firelight pushed back against the encroaching dark. It was a small, defiant island of warmth and life. Here, Elena Merritt worked, her movements economical and certain. She was not a woman given to wasted motion. A skillet, black and heavy, hissed over the flames as she flipped a disk of golden cornbread. The smell of it, clean and honest, mixed with the richer, deeper aroma of beef and root vegetables simmering in a cast-iron pot. She was the camp cook for a small train of settlers, families whose wagons were drawn up in a protective circle, their hopes for a new life in the West temporarily stalled by a broken axle and the town's only blacksmith, who was a drunk more often than he was a smith. But Elena was more than a cook. By day, she gathered the half-dozen children from the wagon train and the few permanent residents of Dry Willow into a disused grain shed and taught them their letters. A piece of charcoal on a smoothed plank of wood served as their education. She was a woman doing two jobs in a place that barely had one to offer. Her face smudged with soot, her hands chapped from lye soap and rough-hewn tools, but her eyes held a steady, unwavering light. As she worked, the whispers followed the wind, curling around the edges of the firelight like smoke. They were quiet, meant to be overheard rather than heard directly. A woman shifting a sleeping child in her arms murmured to her husband, her eyes flicking towards the lone rider who had paused at the edge of the light. "It's him. It's a Harrow," the man grunted, pulling his collar tighter. Thought he was gone for good. "They say bad luck follows that name like a shadow." The woman continued, her voice dropping lower. "Ever since his brother, in the mine." The husband just shook his head, a gesture that was both a dismissal and a confirmation. The story was common currency in Dry Willow. The Harrows brought a blight. Eli Harrow, Cole's older brother, swallowed by the earth in a tunnel collapse at the Crane mine, and Cole, the one who walked out, covered in rock dust but breathing. They said he'd been standing right next to Eli. They said he was lucky, but the way they said lucky sounded a lot like cursed. To stand too close to Cole Harrow was to invite the attention of whatever dark thing had claimed his brother, miles and a world away from the simple fire, in the smoky, amber light of the Golden Spur Saloon. Silas Crane conducted his business. He was a man who looked misplaced in the rough-hewn establishment. His suit was dark wool, perfectly tailored, His hands were clean, his fingernails immaculate. He drank whiskey, but from a clean glass, and he never drank enough to dull the sharp, calculating edge of his mind. He was the owner of the bank, which was a tidy brick building on the corner, and the owner of the silver mine, which was a gaping wound in the hills a few miles north. In Dry Willow, owning the place where men borrowed money and the place where men earned it made you a king. Before him on the table lay a leather-bound ledger, with a fountain pen, its nib scratching softly in the relative quiet of his corner. He was drawing up new lines of debt, adding interest to the accounts of ranchers whose cattle were thin and farmers whose wells had run dry. Each stroke of his pen was a nail in a coffin, another link in a chain that bound the people of this town to him. He didn't look up as the whispers of Cole Harrow's return filtered through the batwing doors. He didn't need to. He knew every soul in this town, their weaknesses, their fears, and their debts. Cole Harrow was just another entry, a loose thread he thought he'd tied off years ago, from his office across the street. Sheriff Ross Harlan watched the town through the slats of his blinds. He saw the flicker of Elena's cook fire and the dark shape of the rider who stood just beyond its reach. He saw the light from the saloon spill onto the street. He was a man who understood order. To him, order was not about justice. Justice was a messy, complicated affair. Order was about quiet. A quiet town was a town under control. The severed bell rope was a symbol of his philosophy. A bell could call people together. It could raise an alarm. It could give voice to a grievance. It could start things. The sheriff preferred endings. He let the silence do his work for him, a heavy blanket that smothered sparks before they could become fires. Cole Harrow's return was a spark. For now. The sheriff simply watched, his hand resting on the cool, worn grip of his own revolver, letting the quiet hold. Cole urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves making soft, thudding sounds in the thick dust of the main street. He didn't ride to the saloon, its loud promises of oblivion holding no appeal. He didn't ride to the livery, though his horse was in sore need of grain and water. He rode towards the fire, towards the scent that had cut through the stale air of the desert. Beef stew. It was a simple, common smell, but it hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the smell of his mother's kitchen, the smell of a time before the mine, before the silence, before the dust had settled into every corner of his life. It was the smell of home, a place that no longer existed. He stopped the Mustang a dozen feet from the fire, just outside the main circle of light. The settlers fell quiet, their conversations dying in their throats. They looked at him, then at their bowls, then at the fire. He was an unwelcome ghost at their feast. Elena looked up from the pot she was stirring. Her spoon paused mid-air. The firelight danced in her eyes, making them seem darker, deeper. She saw the dust, the exhaustion, the hard lines etched around his mouth. But she also saw something else, something buried beneath the layers of grit and time. A stillness. Not the tense, waiting stillness of the town, but a deep, settled quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a river. Their eyes met across the flickering space. There were no words of greeting. He wouldn't have known what to say, and she didn't ask. After a long moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a concession, a question, all of it wrapped in a single, weary gesture. She held his gaze for a second longer, then turned away, breaking the spell. She moved to a stack of clean tin bowls and plates. Across the street, leaning against a veranda post in the shadows outside the saloon, one of Silas Crane's hired men, a thick-necked brute named Jeb, saw the whole exchange. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. It made a dark, sizzling sound. He nudged his partner, a wiry man with nervous eyes. "Well, look at that," Jeb sneered, his voice a low rumble. "Harrow's back. Guess the night ain't gonna be so quiet after all." He laughed, a short, ugly bark that was swallowed by the wind. Elena seemed not to hear. She took one of the bowls and a spoon and set it on the end of a long, makeshift table, a plank of wood laid over 2 barrels. It was the spot furthest from the fire, deepest in the shadows. An invitation that was also a concession to the fear of the others. A place for him, separate but included. Cole dismounted, his joints protesting with a dull ache. He looped the reins around a hitching post that wasn't there, letting them drop to the ground. The horse would not wander. He walked towards the table, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He didn't look at the other settlers, who watched him with wary eyes. He moved to the spot Elena had prepared for him, the one at the very edge of her small world. He took the seat on the rough wooden crate, his back to the solid wall of the general store. It was a defensive position, the choice of a man who never wanted to be caught unawares. He took off his hat and placed it on the table beside the bowl, and then he waited, his hands resting on his thighs, his posture betraying nothing, his face a mask of shadow. He wrapped the silence around himself like a coat of mail, an old and familiar armor against a world that had too much to say. The morning broke thin and pale, the sun a watery eye struggling to see through a film of high, hazy clouds. In the old grain shed, the air was thick with the ghosts of harvests past the sweet, dusty smell of chaff and dried kernels that clung to the timbers. This was Elena's schoolhouse. Light filtered through the cracks between the wallboards in long, golden shafts, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. On a large, chipped piece of slate propped against a wall, one word was written in clean, careful chalk letters. Tomorrow. It was the first word she taught the children, the only one she insisted they learn to write perfectly. It was a promise, a prayer, and an act of defiance in a town that seemed permanently stuck in yesterday. She ladled thick, warm porridge into a series of mismatched bowls, the scraping of the spoon against the pot the only sound. The children, a small flock of 5, were quiet, their faces serious as they focused on the simple meal. They had learned the town's quietness, absorbed it like rainwater into dry soil. Elena's voice, when she spoke, was always soft, a gentle counterpoint to the wind that perpetually worried the corners of the old building. She was teaching them about letters, about the way sounds could be trapped on a page and set free again. But what she was really teaching them was hope. One spoonful of porridge, one chalk-drawn letter at a time. Miles away, but under the same washed-out sky. Cole Harrow was driving fence posts. He was working on the small plot of land belonging to Nora, a widow whose husband had been one of the men lost in the mine collapse that had taken his brother. Her fence had been neglected for years, its posts leaning like tired old men, its wire sagging and broken. It was a line that no longer held. Cole worked with a grim, methodical rhythm. He'd dig the hole with a post-hole digger, his shoulders and back screaming in protest, the hard, dry ground fighting him for every inch. Then he'd set the new cedar post, and with a heavy wooden mallet, he'd drive it deep into the earth. The sound was a series of dull, resonant thuds that carried across the plains. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat for the silent land. The wood was old and dry, splitting under the force of his blows, sending splinters into his calloused palms. The nails he used to secure the wire were rusted, the color of old blood. He pulled one from his leather apron, set its point against the wood, and drove it home with a hammer. The head of the nail missed the mark once, glancing off and tearing a fresh gash across his knuckles. He barely flinched, just watched the welling of bright red blood for a moment before wiping it on his pants and setting another nail. The pain was a familiar companion, a reminder that he was still here, still solid, still capable of feeling something other than the hollow ache of memory. 2 old-timers, perched on a bench outside the general store, watched him work. They chewed on stems of grass and spoke in low tones, their words nearly carried away by the wind. "That's Harrow's boy," one said, stating the obvious. "Thought we was rid of him," the other replied. "Nothing good comes of a harrow digging in the dirt. It's the earth that's got it in for them." The first man nodded slowly, his eyes on the distant, silent church steeple. "They say that bell ain't rung since the night of the big storm, the night Henderson lost his footing on the bridge." He paused, letting the memory hang in the air. His wife wanted the bell rung, to call the men to search, but the storm was too loud. Or maybe, he lowered his voice, Folks just didn't want to hear what the bell had to say. Easier to let the river keep its secrets. They cut the rope the next morning, said it was to keep the peace. The other man spat. Ain't peace. It's just quiet. The quiet of Elena's schoolhouse was broken by the sound of expensive, well-oiled boots on the dusty floorboards. Silas Crane filled the doorway, his large frame blocking out the light. He removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that held no warmth. His smile was a thin, bloodless line. The children instinctively shuffled closer together, their eyes wide. "Miss Merritt," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "a commendable enterprise you have here. Molding the minds of the future." Elena rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood between him and the children, a small, determined barrier. "Mr. Crane, what can I do for you?" "A simple matter of business," he said, letting his gaze drift around the shed, taking in the sacks of grain, the dusty tools, the general state of disrepair. "This structure, as you know, sits on my property. I have been lenient, given the circumstances of your congregation." He used the word as if it tasted sour, but business is business. "The rent for the use of this shed is due at the end of the week, in full, of course." He placed his hat back on his head, the gesture a clear dismissal. The smile never wavered, but his eyes were as cold and hard as silver dollars. Punctuality is the cornerstone of a good reputation. "Miss Merritt, I trust you'll be punctual." He turned and walked away, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Elena looked at the word on the slate. Tomorrow suddenly seemed a lot further away. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harlan rode his horse out to Nora's property line. He stopped a few feet from where Cole was stretching a new line of wire. The sheriff didn't dismount. He sat in his saddle, a man surveying his domain, his hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his gun. "Harrow," he said. It was not a question. Cole didn't stop his work. He pulled the wire taut with a pair of pliers, the metal groaning in protest. "Sheriff, heard you were back in town." "News travels," Cole said, his voice flat. "It does," Harlan agreed. "And trouble usually travels with it. I run a quiet town here." Cole finally stopped and looked up. He squinted against the sun, his eyes meeting the sheriff's. "Looks like you run a broken-down town." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "The fences are the owner's business. The peace is mine. I won't have you stirring up things that are better left buried. Don't cause trouble." Cole picked up his hammer. "I'm just driving posts, Sheriff." He turned back to the fence and drove a staple into the wood with 2 sharp, definitive strikes. The sound was like a period at the end of a sentence. Harlan watched him for another minute, then turned his horse and rode back towards town without another word. The warning had been delivered. The sun was beginning its slow descent when Elena walked out from town, carrying a bucket of water and a tin dipper. Cole saw her coming from a distance. He straightened up, his back protesting, and wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his bloody hand. He watched her walk, the easy, purposeful stride of a woman who knew her own mind. She stopped at the fence line, just as the sheriff had. But unlike him, she offered something. "You look like you could use this," she said, her voice clear and free of the town's usual cautious undertones. He walked over, his boots clumsy in the rutted dirt. He took the dipper she offered, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was a small spark in the vast, empty landscape. He drank deeply, the water cool and clean, washing the dust from his throat. It tasted like life itself. He drank a second dipperful before handing it back to her. "Thank you," he said. The words felt rusty, unused. She just nodded, her eyes on his hands. "You should clean those cuts. It's just fence work." They stood there for a long moment, the newly repaired fence between them. It was a silence, but it was a different kind. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the town, filled with unspoken fears and old grievances. This was a shared quiet, an easy space between 2 people who understood that some things didn't need words. It was comfortable, a small island of peace in the middle of a troubled land, a little girl, no older than 7, with wide, curious eyes and a smattering of freckles across her nose, ran up to the fence. It was Nora's daughter, Sarah. She stopped beside Elena and looked up at the tall, dusty man. Then she turned her gaze to Elena, her expression one of complete earnestness. "Miss Merritt?" she asked, her small voice piping and clear. "When will the bell ring again? Mama says it rang when Papa went to work." The simple, innocent question shattered the comfortable quiet. It was the question no adult in Dry Willow dared to ask. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the child's hopeful face towards the town, her gaze lifting to the church steeple that stood stark against the reddening sky. She saw the heavy, silent bell and the frayed, pathetic stump of the rope that hung uselessly below it. There was no answer she could give. She just looked at the severed rope, a symbol of a voice stolen, a truth silenced. In town, as the lamps were being lit in the Golden Spur Saloon, a new notice was being tacked to the wall, right next to the faded wanted posters. It was a foreclosure notice for a small ranch south of town, its pastures turned to dust by the drought. The legal language was dense and unforgiving, but the final line was clear to all. At the bottom, the signature of Silas Crane was scrawled in thick, black ink. It was an arrogant, sprawling signature, the final C looping back under the name like a striking snake, claiming its territory. As the last of the light bled from the sky, Cole finished his work. The fence was whole again. The line was straight and true, the wire taut. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of the world, but it was a good thing. He gathered his tools, his movements slow and deliberate in the growing dark. He paused, his hand going to his belt, and he drew out the harmonica. He stood there, silhouetted against the purple horizon, and brought the instrument to his lips. He could feel the cool metal against his mouth, the promise of a note, a tune, a single, clear sound to push back against the crushing quiet. He could play a lament for his brother. He could play a song of the road. He could play anything. But he didn't. After a long moment, he lowered the harmonica, the breath he had gathered sighing out of him, unheard. He slid the instrument back into his belt. The silence, for now, had won again. He looked west, towards the jagged peaks of the mountains that walled them in. Dark clouds, the color of bruises, were massing along the ridges, building on each other, growing taller and heavier. The air, which had been dry all day, now felt thick, charged with a strange energy. The quiet of Dry Willow no longer felt like peace or even submission. It felt like the held breath before a lightning strike. It felt like waiting. 3 years ago, the world was not silent. It was a roar, a groaning of timber, a shrieking of stressed metal. Then, the final, deafening crack of the main support beam. Darkness fell, not like night, but like a hammer blow. Absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness filled with the taste of rock dust and the smell of raw, splintered pine. Cole had been there. He and Eli. They were shoring up a new tunnel, a vein of silver that Silas Crane had promised would make them all rich. Eli was laughing at a joke Cole had made, his voice echoing in the close space. Then the groan, the shudder that ran through the earth. Eli stopped laughing. "Go," he'd yelled, his voice tight. "Now." Coal dust rained down, then pebbles, then stones. The oil lamp flickered, its light swallowed by the churning cloud of debris. Cole was frozen, his feet rooted to the spot. Eli shoved him, hard, a powerful, desperate push that sent him stumbling backward, out from under the main beam. Eli Cole screamed. Turning back, he saw his brother for a fraction of a second, a silhouette against the failing lamplight. Eli had his arms up, his back braced against a cross-tie, trying to hold back the mountain. It was impossible. A fool's gesture, an act of love. Then the world fell in. A sound that was also a feeling, a pressure that collapsed the air from Cole's lungs. He was thrown forward by the concussion, and then there was only the sound of rock settling, and silence. A new kind of silence. The silence of a tomb. That was the old cut, the one that never healed. After they dug him out, Silas Crane had stood at the pit head, his face a mask of solemn concern. He'd put a clean hand on Cole's father's shoulder. He spoke of a company insurance policy, a fund for the families, a promise of security. The words were smooth and reassuring, but weeks turned into months. The paperwork, Crane said, was complicated. Then a small, regrettable fire at the land office. The records, he claimed with a sad shake of his head, were lost. Nothing could be done. The Harrow family, who had given a son to the mine, was left with nothing but a shallow grave and the whispers of their neighbors. It was the whispers that drove Cole away. The looks in the general store, the way people would cross the street to avoid him. He was the one who walked out, the lucky one. They said it to his face, but their eyes said something else. They said he was cursed, that he carried the mine's darkness with him. So he left. He rode until the memory of Dry Willow was just another ghost in his dust. But you can't outride a ghost that lives inside your own head. Elena knew about ghosts, too. Hers wasn't from a mine, but from the railroad. His name was Samuel. He was a surveyor, a man who saw the world in clean lines and clear paths. He was going to map a route through the mountains and then come back for her. They were going to build a house with a porch that faced the sunrise. His last letter had been full of excitement. The track was almost through the pass. He was coming home. When you hear the church bell ring for Sunday service, he'd written, "Know that I'll be on the next train. The bell will be for us." She had waited. She had listened. But the Sunday after the letter arrived, the bell in Dry Willow remained silent. The next Sunday, the same. A week later, word came down the line. A blasting accident in the high pass. A rock slide. Samuel's name was on the list. The bell never rang for him. It never rang for them. And then, a few months later, on the night of the Henderson Bridge collapse, it was silenced for good. The quiet town became a constant, mocking reminder of the sound she would never hear. Tonight, that quiet was a physical weight, in a small, rented room above the livery. Cole lay on a narrow cot, his eyes wide open in the dark. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. It dragged him back down into the earth. The dream was always the same. The darkness, the taste of dust, the crushing weight. He is crawling, his hands raw, shouting Eli's name into the suffocating black. There is no answer, just the drip of water somewhere deep in the rock. Then, a hand on his shoulder. Not a shove, this time. A gentle, firm pressure. He turns. He can't see a face, but he knows it's Eli. The hand is a comfort, a forgiveness. But then the grip tightens, the fingers digging into his muscle like claws. The pressure builds, forcing him down, down into the dirt. He is being buried alive, and his brother's hand is the one holding him down. Cole awoke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright. The room was cold. His shirt was soaked with sweat. He could smell the dust from the street, and it was the same smell as the mine. The silence in the room was as heavy and unbreathing as a wall of rock. Across town, in the circle of firelight from the settlers' camp, Elena was also awake. A single lantern cast a warm glow on a plank table. The children and their parents were asleep in their wagons. But she worked on. She had Silas Crane's ledger of debts, borrowed from Nora, and she was meticulously copying it onto fresh paper. A list of the widows of Dry Willow. Nora's name was at the top, followed by a dozen others. Women whose husbands had been taken by the mine, by sickness born of dust, by the simple, grinding hardship of this land. Beside each name was a figure, and a date by which it was due. Most of the dates were tomorrow. Her hand trembled as she wrote, not from fear, but from a deep, simmering anger. This list was a weapon. She was drafting a petition, a formal plea to Silas Crane for a 30-day extension. It was a long shot, a mouse roaring at a lion, but it was something. It was a voice, even if it was only on paper. Her script was shaky, but the words were clear, the intent unwavering. In the Golden Spur saloon, the only voice that mattered was the loudest one. Jeb, Silas Crane's oversized enforcer, was holding court at the bar. He was drunk, his face flushed, his words slurring, but he was proud. In his thick, meaty hand, he held up a small, rust-pitted handsaw. "This here," he bellowed, gesturing with the saw and nearly taking off the bartender's ear. This is what keeps the peace in this town. A few of the other patrons, mostly men on Crane's payroll, laughed and cheered. 3 years ago, it was, Jeb boasted, his memory fueled by whiskey. After that fella went in the river, folks getting all agitated, talking about ringing the bell, stirring up a fuss. "Mr. Crane," he says to me, "Jeb, a bell is for noise, and noise is bad for business. I prefer quiet." So he gives me this saw. He held it up to the lamplight, admiring it as if it were a holy relic. Took me a good hour. Up in that drafty tower. That rope was thick, but I sawed her right through, and she's been quiet ever since. He slammed the saw down on the bar, rattling the glasses. He looked around, his chest puffed out, waiting for his applause. Sheriff Ross Harlan stood at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of rye. He saw the saw. He heard every word of Jeb's drunken confession. He saw the crude pride on the man's face, the open mockery of law and decency. For a moment, his hand tightened around his glass. He could have walked over there. He could have taken the saw as evidence. He could have arrested Jeb for destruction of town property. He could have done his job. Instead, he took a long swallow of his whiskey, the liquor burning a familiar trail down his throat. He turned his back to Jeb and stared at his own reflection in the dusty mirror behind the bar. The law in Dry Willow was quiet, and he intended to keep it that way. Back in his room, Cole knew he wouldn't sleep again. He lit a small oil lamp, the flame chasing the worst of the shadows into the corners. He sat on the edge of the cot and picked up his hammer from the floor. The handle was loose in its head, worn from years of use. He took a long, thin strip of leather from his saddlebag and a small knife. Methodically, he began to unwind the old, frayed grip. He worked in silence, his movements precise. He was fixing a tool, but he was also trying to fix himself, to focus on a single, tangible problem he could solve with his own 2 hands. He wrapped the new leather thong around the handle, pulling each loop tight, creating a new, solid grip. His hands, stained with his own dried blood from the fence posts, worked with a steady, practiced rhythm. He held the finished hammer in his hand. It felt solid, balanced, a good tool. He stood up and walked to the room's single window, looking out over the silent, sleeping town. The clouds he had seen earlier were closer now, smothering the stars. The air was heavy, expectant. He looked towards the church steeple, a dark finger pointing at a dark sky. He thought of the silenced bell, of Jeb's bragging echoing from the saloon, of the sheriff who heard nothing. He thought of his brother, buried under a mountain of rock and silence. He tightened his grip on the new leather handle of his hammer. "There has to be a call," he whispered to the night, his voice rough. "Something louder than the quiet. In the wagon camp." Elena finished her list. She read over the petition letter one last time. It was polite. It was reasonable. It was completely useless. She knew it. A man like Silas Crane would use a letter like this to light his cigar. Pleading was not a strategy. It was a surrender. She looked at the small fire, its embers glowing a fierce, hot red. She folded the letter carefully, but she did not put it in an envelope. She held it in her hand, watching the firelight flicker and dance in her dark, determined eyes. The flames caught the moisture on her lashes, and for a moment, it looked as though stars were falling, burning brightly just before they disappeared into the night. She wouldn't be sending a letter. She would have to find a different way to make them listen. The afternoon came on not with the slow, gentle fade of a normal day, but with a sudden, angry change in the wind. It shifted from the north, carrying a cold, biting edge that promised a storm. It howled down the main street of Dry Willow, picking up dust and grit and flinging it like a fistful of sand against windows. Shutters rattled, signs creaked on their hinges, and the whole town seemed to hunch its shoulders against the assault. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, began to curdle, darkening to the color of a fresh bruise. Out on Nora's small patch of land, the wind was a physical force, a bully trying to tear the world apart. The fence line that Cole had spent the previous day mending was now under siege. The wire screamed, stretched to its breaking point, but it was an old corner post, one he hadn't yet replaced. That was failing. It leaned at a precarious angle, the earth around its base crumbling with each new gust. Inside the fence, a half-dozen young calves, skittish and frightened by the storm, huddled together, their backs to the wind. If the post gave way, the wire would slacken and they would bolt, scattering into the treacherous, rock-strewn gullies that bordered the property. For a widow like Nora, losing even one would be a disaster. Cole was there, his duster whipping around him, fighting to hold the post upright. He dug around its base, trying to pack more rock and soil into the hole, but the ground was like iron, and the wind was a constant, shoving hand against his back. He wasn't strong enough to both hold the post and drive it deeper. He saw Elena coming, leaning into the wind, her skirts plastered against her legs. She carried no water bucket this time, just a grim determination on her face. She didn't waste time with questions. She saw the problem, saw the straining muscles in Cole's back, saw the terrified eyes of the calves. "I'll hold it," she shouted over the wind's roar. "You drive it." It was not a request. Cole nodded, ceding the post to her. She wedged herself against it, her shoulder braced against the rough cedar, her boots planted firmly in the loose dirt. She wrapped her arms around the wood, her knuckles white. The post was heavy, vibrating with the strain of the wire. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face, but she didn't flinch. Her jaw was set. Cole grabbed the heavy mallet. Its new leather grip felt solid and sure in his hands. He stood over the post, his legs spread for balance. The target was small, the wind a treacherous variable. A missed swing could hit Elena. He didn't let himself think about it. He lifted the mallet, his muscles coiling. "Ready," he yelled. She just grunted in response, her whole body tensed. He brought the mallet down. Thwack! The sound was flat, eaten by the wind. The post shuddered, but it barely moved. A shower of dust and splinters flew from its top. Again Elena gasped, the word torn from her lips. He swung again. Thwack! And again. Thwack! It was brutal, punishing work. The ground was a stubborn fist, refusing to yield. Sweat poured down Cole's face, stinging his eyes. Every muscle in his back and shoulders burned. Beside him, Elena grunted with each impact, her body absorbing the shock, her grip unwavering. She was an anchor in the storm, as rooted and stubborn as the unforgiving earth itself. Two figures were hurrying down the road, heads bent against the wind, trying to get to the shelter of the general store before the heavens opened up. It was Martha, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose tongue was the sharpest instrument in town, and a ranch hand named Peterson. They paused for a moment, drawn by the desperate, rhythmic pounding. They saw the two figures at the fence line, a man swinging a mallet, a woman braced against the post, their bodies working in a tight, urgent unison. The wind dropped for a brief, deceptive second, and in the sudden lull, Elena's voice carried, thin but clear. She was exhausted, her lungs burning, her vision starting to blur at the edges. The post had sunk an inch, maybe two, but it wasn't enough. It was still loose, still in danger of giving way. She could feel it shifting. Deeper, she cried out, her voice raw with effort. She pushed with all her might, trying to drive it down with her own weight. "Please, just one more time." It was a plea born of desperation, a phrase about fence posts and survival. But to Martha and Peterson, standing 100 feet away, it was something else entirely. Martha's eyes widened, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across her face. Peterson just coughed into his hand, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. They exchanged a look, a silent, shared judgment. The story was already writing itself in their minds, a much more interesting tale than one of a broken fence. Without another word, they hurried on their way, carrying their freshly minted piece of gossip, ready to trade it for a moment of warmth and attention inside the store. The rumor, carried on the back of the wind, would now travel faster than the coming rain. Cole heard nothing but the roar of the wind and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He heard the desperation in Elena's voice, the raw need for this one final effort to succeed. He channeled all his strength, all his frustration, all the silent rage he carried inside him, into one last perfect swing. He put his entire body into it, a grunt of pure exertion tearing from his throat. Thwump! The sound was different this time, deeper, more solid. The post sank a good 6 inches into the hard earth, lodging itself firmly against a buried rock. It stood straight and true, the wire beside it now humming with tension. Secure. The immediate danger was over. The calves were safe. For a moment, neither of them moved. They were frozen in place, listening to the wind, feeling the vibrations of the final blow fade into the ground. Then, as one, their strength gave out. Cole dropped the mallet, his arms feeling like lead. Elena's legs buckled, and she slid down the side of the post. They collapsed onto the dusty ground next to each other, their backs against the fence they had just saved. They sat there, side by side, chests heaving, lungs dragging in the thick, storm-charged air. Their heartbeats were a frantic, desperate drum, a rhythm that slowly began to match the howling of the wind. Cole looked at his hands. They were trembling, the knuckles raw and bleeding again. He looked at Elena. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a wild tangle, a small cut on her cheek where a splinter had flown. She looked utterly exhausted and more alive than anyone he had ever seen. The silence between them returned, but it had changed again. It was no longer comfortable or merely peaceful. It was something more. It was soft. It was the quiet of a shared battle won, of mutual respect earned in sweat and strain. It was the silence of two people who had just seen the strength in each other, raw and unadorned. It was strangely gentle. Then, a small sound broke through the wind. It was a choked gasp, then another. Elena was laughing. It wasn't a polite, gentle laugh. It was a deep, helpless, full-bodied laugh that came from the very core of her. A laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the most beautiful sound Cole had ever heard. It was the sound of a crack appearing in a thick wall of ice. He stared at her for a moment, a look of profound confusion on his face. And then, he felt it starting in his own chest, a rumble, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. He smiled, a real smile, not the tight, grim line his mouth usually held. And then he was laughing too. His was a rough, rusty sound, like an old engine turning over for the first time in years. But it was genuine, sitting there in the dirt, with a storm about to break over their heads. The two of them laughed until tears streamed down their faces, mingling with the dust and sweat. It was a sound that had not been heard in Dry Willow for a very long time, a sound of something other than silence finally winning. In the Golden Spur Saloon, Silas Crane stood at the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the sky darken. The door opened, letting in a blast of wind and Martha, who immediately made a beeline for a group of women huddled by the cold stove. Silas couldn't hear her words, but he saw the way the women leaned in, the way their expressions changed from boredom to avid interest. He saw Martha gesture vaguely in the direction of Nora's place. A few moments later, a ripple of snickering laughter spread through the room. Silas turned from the window, a thin, contemptuous smile on his lips. He raised his glass in a mock toast to the room at large. "The simple amusements of debtors," he said to the bartender, his voice dripping with condescension. "When they cannot pay their bills, they find other exertions to occupy their time." From his office across the street, Sheriff Harlan also saw them. He'd been watching the struggle at the fence line. He'd seen the desperate effort, the final, successful blow. And now he saw Elena, her laughter having subsided, gently take a handkerchief from her pocket and begin to wipe the mud and blood from Cole's torn knuckles. It was a small, simple gesture, an act of care. There was no law against it. There was no ordinance that could govern it. He saw the way Cole watched her, his usual guarded expression gone, replaced by something open and vulnerable. The sheriff felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a moment of confusion. His entire world was built on a foundation of quiet, predictable order. This was not that. This was messy and human and alive. For a brief, unsettling moment, he wondered what kind of law could ever hope to keep a thing like this quiet. And then it came. A single drop of rain, fat and heavy, splattered in the dust at Cole's feet. Then another, and another. It wasn't a drizzle. It was the sudden, violent breaking of the drought. The sky opened up, and the rain came down in hard, cleansing sheets. It hissed as it hit the hot, dry earth, the smell of wet dust, the scent of life itself rising up to meet them. All across Dry Willow, people stopped what they were doing. They came to their doorways, their windows, and they looked up, their faces tilted towards the sky, letting the first real rain in years wash the dust away. The rain that had started as a blessing turned into a siege. For 2 days and 2 nights, it fell without pause, a relentless, drumming curtain of gray that dissolved the hard edges of the world. The dust of Dry Willow was gone, replaced by a thick, clinging mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. The sun was a forgotten memory. The world had shrunk to the sound of water, the endless roar on the rooftops, the gurgle in the overflowing rain barrels, the steady, hungry rush of Dry Creek. What was normally a polite, meandering stream was now a churning, brown beast. It had swollen to the top of its banks, its surface littered with debris branches, leaves, the occasional piece of a broken fence. It pulled at the pilings of the town's only wooden bridge, and the old timbers groaned in protest, a long, low sound like a creature in pain. The town was an island, cut off from the outside world, trapped by the very water it had prayed for. On the second day, a new sound joined the drumming of the rain, a sharp, insistent knocking. It was Silas Crane, making his rounds. He was impervious to the weather, protected by a long oilskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat from which water dripped in a steady stream. He went from door to door, not with the false pleasantries he usually employed, but with a grim, businesslike purpose. In his hand, he carried a sheaf of papers, protected from the rain by a waxed canvas folder. He didn't need to force his way in. The knock was enough of a summons. He would stand in the doorway, letting the damp chill of the storm invade the small, fire-lit rooms, and present his document. A necessary precaution, he would announce, his voice a calm, reasonable drone against the storm's fury. The floodwaters are threatening the structural integrity of the lower town. My properties. A small, one-time flood protection fee is required from all residents to fund the emergency reinforcements. He would point to the bottom of the page, where a space was marked for a signature. The papers were slick with a thin film of oil and bore the smudges of his dirty glove. Most people, bewildered by the legalese, intimidated by his presence, and terrified by the rising water, simply signed. They signed away money they didn't have, adding another link to the chains of debt that already bound them to him. Elena saw him from the window of the grain shed, where she'd given shelter to the settler families. She watched him move from Nora's small house to the next, a dark, methodical bird of prey. Nora came into the shed a few minutes later, her face pale, the paper clutched in her hand. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said if I didn't sign, he'd have the sheriff evict me for endangering the community." Elena took the paper. The ink was slightly blurred from the damp. It was a contract, dense with clauses and conditions. But Elena wasn't looking at the legal terms. Her eyes, accustomed to teaching children their letters, scanned the words themselves, and then she saw it. A small, insignificant detail that most would overlook. In the heading, the words flooding fee were misspelled. The second O was missing. Floating fee. A simple mistake. But when 2 other women came in, their own papers in hand, Elena saw the exact same error, in the exact same place. It wasn't a mistake. It was a template. A single, hastily prepared form, mass-produced for the purpose of this extortion. No official bank document would carry such a consistent, careless flaw. This was the work of a forger, not a banker. While Elena was studying the ink, Cole was studying the water. The rumor of emergency reinforcements had bothered him. It didn't feel right. He knew this land, knew its contours, its hidden waterways. The real danger wasn't a slow rise of the creek. It was a flash flood from Coyote Canyon, a narrow gorge a mile upstream that channeled runoff from the high mesas. Years ago, miners had built a small, temporary check dam there, a crude wall of rock and timber meant to hold back storm surges long enough for the main creek to handle the flow. If that dam failed, a wall of water would scour Dry Willow from the map. He rode out in the driving rain, his horse slipping and sliding in the mud. The roar of the water grew louder as he approached the canyon, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated up through the horse's hooves. He found the dam. It was holding, but barely. Water was pouring over the top in a thick brown sheet, but it was the anchor point on the far side that drew his eye. A thick hemp rope, as thick as his arm, was meant to secure the main timber brace to a massive iron pin sunk deep into the canyon wall. The rope was frayed, not from the strain, but from something else. He dismounted, wading through the knee-high, fast-moving water to get a closer look. The rope had been cut, or rather, sawn. 3/4 of the way through. The fibers were clean cut, not torn. Someone had deliberately weakened it, leaving just enough to hold for now, waiting for the pressure to reach a breaking point. It was sabotage. Someone didn't just want to collect a fee, they wanted to create a disaster. As he turned to leave, his boot heels sank into a patch of soft mud near the canyon wall, sheltered from the main current. Beside the impression his own boot had made, there was another. It was larger, the sole worn smooth in places, with a distinctive nick in the heel. But it was what was in the print that made him stop. Embedded in the mud, deep in the tread, were tiny, sharp-edged fragments of black rock, coal, not the kind of rock found in this canyon. It was the slate-like coal from the tailings pile of the Crane mine, and there was a smell, faint, but unmistakable. The heavy, greasy smell of the oil they used to lubricate the mine's machinery. Back in the grain shed, the storm raged outside, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Elena had tacked the 3 contracts to her makeshift blackboard. With a piece of chalk, she circled the misspelled word on each one. He didn't even bother to check his own work, she said, her voice tight with anger. He assumed no one would look closely. He assumed we were all too scared, or too ignorant, to see the lie. Cole entered then, dripping water onto the floorboards, his face grim. He didn't say a word. He walked to the blackboard. He took the chalk from her hand, and below her circled words. He drew a rough map of the canyon, the dam, and the severed rope. Then he drew a boot print. Inside it, he sketched small, dark specks. He looked at Elena. Coal, he said, from the mine, and oil. She stared at the board, her mind racing, connecting the pieces. She took the chalk back. Her hand was steady now, her purpose clear. She drew a line from the boot print to a crude stick figure she labeled Silas's man. From that figure, she drew another line to the contracts, which she labeled flood fee, and from the contracts, she drew a final, damning arrow to a drawing of a small house with a large for sale sign hammered into its yard. The diagram was stark and simple. The mud from the mine connected the saboteur to Silas's operation. The sabotage was meant to create a real flood, a catastrophe that would drive people from their homes. And the fraudulent flood fee was the tool to bleed them dry, to force them to sell their land to the one man with enough cash to buy it, the one man who stood to profit from their ruin. The railroad, Elena whispered, the final piece clicking into place. They're surveying a route through here. If a man owned all this land when they came through, he'd be a king. Cole finished for her, his voice hard as iron. They knew the truth, but knowing it and proving it were 2 different worlds. They went to the sheriff's office. The room was dark, smelling of stale coffee and damp wool. Sheriff Harlan sat behind his desk, cleaning his pistol, his movements slow and methodical. He didn't look up as they entered. He listened without comment as they laid it all out. Elena presented the contracts, pointing out the identical errors. Cole described the sawn rope, the boot print, the coal. He laid a small, muddy lump of it, which he'd wrapped in his handkerchief, on the sheriff's desk. When they were finished, Harlan finally looked up. He poked at the lump of coal with the tip of his cleaning rod. He glanced at the contracts. His face was unreadable. "It's a good story," he said, his voice flat. A man could almost believe it. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "But what have you got?" "A spelling mistake. A boot print in the mud that'll be washed away by morning. Some coal that could have come from anywhere. It's not evidence." "Harrow, it's speculation." "That rope is evidence," Cole countered, his voice rising. "A frayed rope in a storm," the sheriff said with a dismissive wave. "And as for these fees, Silas Crane is a respected businessman. He's funding reinforcements. That's what he'll say. And who will this town believe him? Or you, a man who carries a curse?" He paused, his eyes cold. "You have no proof, and you have no bell. You can't call the town together. You can't raise an alarm. No one will gather for a whisper. In Dry Willow, the only thing people listen to is silence." A muscle twitched in Cole's jaw. The sheriff was right. Without a way to rally the people, to present their case publicly, their knowledge was useless. The silence was Silas Crane's greatest weapon, and the sheriff was its willing guard. Cole looked at the man who was meant to uphold the law, a man who chose quiet over justice. Slowly, deliberately. Cole reached down and took the hammer from the loop on his belt, the one with the new leather grip. He stepped forward and placed it on the sheriff's desk. It landed with a solid, heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. It was not a threat. It was a promise. "If the bell won't ring," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous, "I will make it heard." Harlan's eyes narrowed. The two men stared at each other across the desk, the hammer lying between them like a declaration of war. The quiet order of the sheriff's world had just been irrevocably broken. Elena felt the tension arc between them, a palpable, dangerous energy. She stepped forward and placed her hand on Cole's arm, on the damp sleeve of his duster. Her touch was light, but firm. He didn't look at her, but he felt it, a small point of warmth in the cold room. "Not alone," she said, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm of his anger. Just then, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, so bright it bleached the room of all color for a split second. It was followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. The time for quiet investigation was over. The time had come. The night had become a living thing, a predator made of wind and water and roaring sound. At the check dam in Coyote Canyon, 3 men worked like demons in a Bosch painting, their figures distorted by the frantic, dancing light of a single torch. The largest of them, Jeb, had his weight against a long saw, its teeth biting into the last remaining fibers of the thick anchor rope. The groan of the stressed wood was a high, keening sound, almost lost beneath the thunderous applause of the overflowing water. The dam itself, a crude wall of timber and rock, shuddered with every fresh wave that crashed against it, threatening to give way even before the rope was fully severed. The torch, jammed into a crevice in the rock wall, cast their shadows long and monstrous against the canyon, a frantic pantomime of destruction. They were a sound before they were a sight, a desperate, rhythmic sucking and plunging of hooves in the deep mud, a sound that did not belong in the canyon's symphony of chaos. Jeb paused, his arm aching, and looked down the narrow gorge. He saw it then, a single, dark shape, moving impossibly fast through the storm. 1 horse, 2 riders, company. He grunted, putting his shoulder back into the saw. "Finish it." Cole drove the Mustang harder, the horse's lungs burning, its powerful muscles straining with the double load and the treacherous footing. Elena was pressed tightly against his back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face buried against the wet, cold fabric of his duster. She had a coil of new, thick rope slung over her shoulder, and in her other hand, she gripped the handle of a heavy, cast-iron skillet she had grabbed from the camp kitchen. It was a ridiculous weapon, but it was solid and heavy, and she had no intention of arriving empty-handed. The canyon was a death trap. Rocks, loosened by the rain, tumbled down the steep walls. A half-drowned pine tree, its roots giving way, crashed into the torrent just ahead of them, exploding into a shower of splinters. The sound of the water was no longer a roar, it was a physical pressure, a high-pitched shriek like 1,000 violins all snapping their strings at once. It was the sound of the world tearing apart. They reached the dam as Jeb gave one last, mighty heave on the saw. With a sound like a pistol shot, the last fibers of the old anchor rope parted. The main timber brace, now unsecured, shifted a foot, and a torrent of water exploded through the new gap. The entire structure groaned, threatening imminent collapse. Cole didn't hesitate. Before the Mustang had even come to a full stop, he was out of the saddle, landing in the churning, calf-deep water. The lever he yelled to Elena, pointing at a long iron bar connected to the dam's sluice gate mechanism. He ran towards the opposite bank, the new rope in his hands, his goal, the iron pin where the old rope had been anchored. Elena slid off the horse, the skillet feeling both heavy and inadequate. She saw Cole struggling to loop the new rope over the shifting brace, his boots slipping on the slick rock. She saw the other two men, one wiry, the other nondescript, advancing on him from the shadows. She ran for the lever. It was rusted, frozen in place. She threw her whole weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. The wiry man reached Cole first. He didn't have a weapon, just his own brute force. He slammed his shoulder into Cole's side, knocking him off balance, away from the brace. Cole stumbled, falling to one knee in the rushing water. Elena saw it happen. There was no time to think. She reversed her grip on the skillet, holding it by the handle like a club. She swung it with all the force of her fear and her anger. There was a sickening, metallic clang as the flat, heavy bottom of the pan connected with the side of the wiry man's head. He crumpled without a sound, his torch flying from his hand and extinguishing with a hiss in the water. The man dropped like a sack of grain, a stunned expression on his face. The third man, seeing his partner fall, pulled a long, wicked-looking knife and lunged for Cole, who was just getting back to his feet. Cole didn't have time to draw his gun to fire. Instead, he pulled the heavy Colt Peacemaker and used it as a shield. The knife scraped against the gun's barrel with a high-pitched shriek of steel on steel, a shower of orange sparks illuminating their faces for a grotesque instant. The air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of hot metal. Cole twisted the gun, trapping the man's blade, and brought his knee up hard into his stomach. The man gasped, the knife clattering to the rocks as he doubled over. Elena Cole roared, turning his attention to Jeb, who was now using a crowbar to pry the main brace completely free. The lever Elena was already there, throwing her entire body against the cold iron bar. It groaned, scraped, and then moved, just an inch. The gate was meant to be operated by two strong men, not one exhausted woman. But desperation gave her strength. She set her feet, took a deep breath, and pushed. The metal shrieked in protest. The sluice gate, a heavy grate of iron and wood, began to slide downwards, fighting the pressure of the water. At that moment, the weakened dam gave way. It wasn't a slow collapse. It was an instantaneous, explosive failure. A wall of water, a solid, churning mass of mud and rock and uprooted trees, surged down the narrow canyon. Cole saw it coming. He abandoned his fight with Jeb and scrambled back towards the gate mechanism, throwing his own weight next to Elena's. Together, they gave one last, desperate shove. With a final, deafening clang, the sluice gate slammed shut, its iron bolts seating home just as the flash flood hit. The impact was apocalyptic. The earth itself seemed to shudder. A wave of water crashed over the top of the gate, drenching them. But the main force of the flood was held back. The reinforced gate, the one part of the dam that was properly engineered, was holding. The floodwaters, denied their straight path, slammed into the canyon walls, boiling and churning, but their momentum was broken. The immediate, catastrophic threat to Dry Willow had been slowed, deflected. The town had a chance. The backlash of the wave tore at them. Elena lost her footing on the slick, vibrating rock. She cried out as she fell backward, towards the churning water. Cole lunged, dropping the rope, and wrapped his arms around her. They went down together, tumbling off the narrow ledge and rolling into a shallow sandbar at the edge of the torrent, a small island of relative calm amidst the chaos. They lay there for a long moment, tangled in each other's arms, the world a dizzying, roaring blur. All they knew was the solidness of the ground beneath them and the desperate, ragged sound of their own breathing. They were gasping, not just for air, but for life itself, like newborns taking their first breath. The water rushed past them, inches away, but they were safe. They were alive. Jeb, seeing the gate closed and his partners down, panicked. He threw down his crowbar, gave one last look of pure hatred at Cole and Elena, and scrambled up the far canyon wall, disappearing into the darkness. In his haste, his foot caught on a leather satchel that had been lying at his feet. The bag tumbled down the rocks and came to rest near the water's edge, not 10 feet from where they lay. Slowly, the world came back into focus. The roar of the water began to subside as the initial surge passed, settling into a steady, powerful rush. The thunder, which had been a constant cannonade overhead, began to rumble its way east, the flashes of lightning growing less frequent. The rain softened from a downpour to a steady, almost gentle drizzle. The only sounds left were the rush of the creek, which now seemed to be breathing more slowly, and the harsh, ragged sound of their own gasps for air. Cole pushed himself up onto one elbow. He looked down at Elena. Her eyes were closed, her face pale in the gloom, but her chest was rising and falling. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep, and held no trace of fear. He followed her gaze. She was looking at the leather satchel. It was a well-made bag, the kind a man of business would carry, and on its flap, embossed in the wet leather, was the unmistakable seal of the Dry Willow Bank Trust, the looping, serpentine signature of Silas Crane. The third henchman was already gone, having fled after Cole had dealt with him. The wiry one was beginning to stir, groaning as he pushed himself into a sitting position, his head in his hands. He was no longer a threat. The fight was over. Cole looked back at Elena, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto her face. He saw the fire in her eyes, a reflection of the torchlight that had burned so briefly, now rekindled as a cold, hard flame of resolve. All the exhaustion, all the fear, fell away, replaced by a single, sharp point of clarity. They had the proof, they had the weapon, and now they knew exactly what they had to do. "We ring the bell," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying over the sound of the water with the weight of an oath. Elena didn't need words. She just nodded, her eyes, bright and fierce as a hearth fire on a cold winter's night, holding his. Dawn did not break. It seeped, a slow, gray dilution of the night, turning the world from black to the color of wet ash. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world dripping and clean-smelling, the air washed of its dust. It was in this cold, quiet light that Cole and Elena moved toward the church. They didn't speak. Their purpose was a silent, shared thing, a weight they carried between them. The church door groaned open on swollen hinges. Inside, the air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp hymnals and decaying wood. Their boots echoed on the worn floorboards as they walked past the empty pews and to a small, narrow door at the base of the steeple. The climb was a journey into the town's forgotten heart. The stairs were steep and treacherous, little more than a ladder, each step coated in a fine layer of dust and bird droppings. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, brushed against their faces, with every foot of ascent. The sounds of the waking town a distant cough, the clatter of a bucket faded, replaced by the whispering of the wind through the louved vents of the belfry. They emerged into the bell chamber itself. It was a stark, skeletal space, open to the gray sky on all four sides, and in the center, suspended from a massive, age-blackened beam, hung the bell. It was larger than they had imagined, a colossal bronze throat, its surface streaked green with years of weather and neglect. It was a sleeping giant, a silent oracle, and hanging from its great iron wheel was the source of its silence, the rope. It had been severed about 10 feet from the top, the end a frayed, pathetic stump, a gag in the mouth of the town. It was a sight of profound desecration. Cole said nothing. He simply uncoiled the lariat from his shoulder, the rope that was as much a part of him as his own arm. He tested its weight, its familiar texture a small comfort in this strange, high place. He looked at the massive wheel, at the precarious framework of beams supporting it. "Hold the end of this," he said to Elena, his voice a low command. "Don't let it go." He handed her the coiled bulk of the rope and began to climb, using the cross braces of the steeple as handholds. His movements were slow, deliberate, the measured grace of a man accustomed to heights and risk. He reached the level of the bell's yoke and shimmied out onto the main support beam. Below him, the ground was a dizzying drop. The wind tore at his clothes, trying to push him from his perch. He ignored it. He worked the tough, flexible rawhide of his lariat around the thick wooden spokes of the bell's wheel, looping it twice for strength, and securing it with a knot that would tighten under pressure. He then tossed the free end down to the belfry floor. It was a makeshift solution, but it would hold. He climbed back down, his face set in grim lines. Elena had been watching, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She hadn't breathed until his feet were firmly on the floorboards beside her. Down below, in the muddy churchyard, a small figure had appeared. Then another. It was the children, Nora's daughter, Sarah, and the others from the wagon train. They had heard the church door open and had followed, their curiosity overriding their parents' warnings. They stood in a small, silent cluster, their upturned faces pale in the gray light, watching the steeple as if expecting a miracle. As Cole took the newly rigged rope in his hands, two more figures appeared at the churchyard gate, Sheriff Ross Harlan and Silas Crane. They moved with a purpose that was entirely different from the children's innocent curiosity. The sheriff walked with his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a habit that had become an unconscious part of his posture. Crane walked beside him, his fine wool coat unsoiled, his face a mask of cold fury, as composed and hard as a piece of freshly quarried stone. They stopped at the base of the steeple, their presence a palpable challenge. Silas Crane looked up, his voice carrying effortlessly on the still, damp air. It was a smooth voice, accustomed to command, coated in a thin veneer of civility that made it all the more menacing. A word of advice. "Mr. Harrow," he called out. "Whoever rings that bell will be held responsible for the chaos and public disorder that follows. This is a quiet town. It has laws. The sheriff will enforce them." It was a perfectly crafted threat, wrapping itself in the language of law and order. Cole ignored him. He looked down at the sheriff, at the badge pinned to his chest, the symbol of a trust that had long since been betrayed. The law needs a voice. "Sheriff." Cole's voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, sharp and clear. "It's been silent for too long, for a long, stretched moment." The sheriff did not move. He stood caught between the banker's cold command and the cowboy's raw appeal. His eyes, for a fleeting second, lost their hard, cynical edge. They flickered with something else, a ghost of a different man, a younger man who might have believed that a badge meant more than just keeping things quiet. It was a moment of profound indecision, a glimpse of a man's soul balanced on the edge of a knife. Then the moment passed. The hardness returned to his eyes, but he did not draw his weapon. He simply stood, a silent, unwilling witness. Cole took that as his answer. He wrapped the rough lariat around his hands, the leather digging into his skin. He braced his feet on the dusty floorboards, leaned back, and pulled. For a second, nothing happened. The mechanism was frozen with rust and disuse. The great weight of the bell resisted, a stubborn, dead weight. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining, the tendons in his neck standing out like cords. He pulled again, harder this time, a low grunt tearing from his throat. There was a loud, groaning shriek of metal on metal, the sound of a tomb being forced open. The great wheel turned, the bell tilted, and then it rang. It was not a pleasant sound. It was not the gentle peal of a Sunday morning. It was a deep, resonant bong, a sound so powerful it was a physical blow. It struck the damp air and shattered the years of silence into a million pieces. The sound wave rolled out over the rooftops of Dry Willow, a thing of substance and power. Pigeons exploded from the eaves of the general store, their wings beating in a frantic cloud. Down in the churchyard, the children flinched, their hands flying to their ears. Cole let the rope slide, and the bell swung back. He caught the momentum and pulled again. Bong! The second toll was deeper, surer, a confirmation of the first. It was a heartbeat, strong and slow, for a town that had forgotten it was alive. He let it swing one last time. Bong! The third toll was a summons, a declaration. It hung in the air, vibrating in the wood of the houses, in the bones of the people who heard it. It was the sound of an ending, and the sound of a beginning. Doors began to open. People emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and awe. They looked towards the church, towards the impossible sound. They gathered in the street, a slow, hesitant tide of humanity, drawn by the call they thought they would never hear again. Down in the churchyard. Elena stepped forward as Cole descended from the tower. She waited until he was at her side. Then she turned to face the growing crowd. In her hand, she held up the leather satchel they had recovered from the canyon. She held it high, for all to see. This bag was dropped last night at the Coyote Canyon Dam. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried the authority of truth. It bears the seal of Silas Crane's bank, and it smells of the oil and coal from his mine. She walked to the front of the crowd, letting them see the embossed seal, letting the faint, greasy scent of the mine drift towards them. A low murmur went through the assembled townspeople. They had all smelled that smell on their husbands and sons. They knew it well. Cole stepped forward to stand beside her. He looked out at the faces before him, faces he had known his whole life. He saw fear, he saw doubt, but he also saw a flicker of something else, a spark of defiance. "Silence," he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Silence almost killed us all last night. While you slept, men were sent to break the dam and wash this town away, so that one man could buy your land for pennies on the dollar." A sharp, derisive laugh cut through the tense air. It was Silas Crane. He stepped forward, his expression one of amused contempt. "This is a pathetic distraction," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. He gestured towards Cole and Elena. "A performance by two desperate debtors. They owe the bank a significant sum. They would say anything, do anything, to avoid their obligations. This is slander, nothing more." He looked directly at Sheriff Harlan, his eyes commanding. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for inciting a riot and this woman for spreading malicious falsehoods." The crowd fell silent, their eyes shifting to the sheriff. He was the law. The choice was his. He looked at the leather bag. He looked at the hard, determined faces of Cole and Elena. He looked at the expectant faces of the townspeople. His hand, which had never left the butt of his pistol, now rested on it with a weary finality. "I can't make an arrest based on a bag that smells funny." "Cole," he said, his voice tired but firm, "Silas is right about one thing. This isn't proof. It's a story. I need more." Cole's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had risked everything, had broken the silence, and it still wasn't enough. The old rules, the old fears, still held the town in their grip. He took a step towards the sheriff, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "All right, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl of promise. "You want more, then we'll get you more." Cole didn't move from the sheriff's side. He just nodded to Elena. It was her turn first. Her evidence was the foundation, the cold, hard logic upon which the rest would be built. She walked not to the front of the crowd, but to the lich gate at the entrance to the churchyard, where a wide, flat-topped stone wall served as a makeshift table, with a calm deliberation that silenced the nervous murmuring of the crowd. She laid out the 3 flood fee contracts she had collected. They were dark with damp, the ink slightly feathered, but the words were legible. "These are Mr. Crane's contracts," she began, her voice not loud, but carrying with a teacher's authority that commanded attention. "He presented them yesterday as official documents from his bank, demanding a fee to protect us from a flood he himself was creating." A ripple of anger went through the crowd. Silas Crane laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The desperate lies of a schoolteacher. Read the documents. They are perfectly legal." "Are they?" Elena asked, a dangerous quiet in her voice. She picked up a small piece of charcoal from the ground. "I teach children their letters every day. Mr. Crane. I notice things. For example, I noticed that on every single one of these contracts, the word flooding is misspelled." She circled the word on the top contract with the charcoal, FLODING. The same mistake, on every copy. As if they were all printed from the same cheap, flawed template, not drawn up by a professional banker. She let the crowd absorb this, their eyes squinting at the papers. It was a small thing, but it was a crack in Crane's facade of legitimacy. "But a spelling error is not a crime," she continued, her voice hardening. "Forgery is—" She pointed with the charcoal to the official-looking seal pressed into the paper at the bottom of each contract. "This is the seal of the Dry Willow Bank Trust, or it's meant to be. But if you look closely—" She paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to lean in. "The official seal of the bank is perfectly level. I've seen it on my own deposit slips. This one is tilted. On every single contract, it is tilted by precisely 7 degrees to the left." She drew a faint horizontal line and a second angled line to illustrate. "It's a fake," she said, her voice dropping like the fall of a judge's gavel, "a forged stamp made by a clumsy hand, used to create fraudulent documents to steal your money and your land." The crowd was silent now, a heavy, listening silence. The accusation was no longer a vague story. It was a thing of angles and spelling mistakes, of details they could see and understand. Cole stepped forward then, into the space Elena had created. He held up a short, frayed piece of thick rope, its ends cleanly sawn. "This is what was left of the anchor rope at the dam this morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. He then opened his hand, showing the black, muddy lumps of coal. "And this was found in the boot print of the man who cut it. This is mine coal, from Crane's mine." A young boy from the wagon train, emboldened by the bell and the sight of his teacher speaking so bravely, pointed a small, grubby finger towards the church. Propped against the wall was the large slate blackboard from the grain shed. He and the other children had dragged it there, and on it, in the clear, careful letters Elena had taught them, was the diagram she had drawn, the boot print, the arrow to the contracts, the final arrow to the words, "Take our homes." It was a child's drawing, but it had the devastating simplicity of the truth. All eyes now turned to the 2 henchmen who stood near Silas Crane, their faces pale. The wiry man, the one from the canyon, had a crude bandage wrapped around his head, a dark stain seeping through it. He was trembling, his eyes darting about like a cornered animal. Elena walked slowly towards him. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She simply stopped in front of him and asked a single, quiet question. "Who gave you the leather satchel?" The man flinched as if struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He couldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't look at the crowd. His terrified gaze flickered, for just a second, to the face of Silas Crane. It was enough. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The silent accusation was as damning as a shouted confession. Silas Crane's composure finally broke. "This is a circus," he snarled, his face contorting in a mask of rage. "A complete and utter fabrication orchestrated by these criminals. Is it?" "Silas." The voice was slow, tired, and it came from Sheriff Harlan. All heads turned. The sheriff had walked forward and picked up the leather satchel from the wall where Elena had placed it. He held it up, not by the strap, but by the bottom corner. "Because this bag has your initials tooled into the leather. Right here. S.C. Faint. But they're there. Looks like your handwriting." Crane stared at the bag, his mouth agape. He had been caught by his own vanity, a small detail he had long since forgotten. The link was now direct, tangible. The silence that followed was different. It was the old silence, the one of fear and uncertainty, trying to creep back in and reclaim the town. It was the silence that had followed the mine collapse, the silence that had allowed injustice to fester for years. Cole felt it. He felt the crowd's resolve begin to waver, their fear of Crane warring with their newfound anger. He knew that logic and evidence were not enough. They needed to feel the truth, not just hear it. He reached into his belt and drew out his harmonica. The crowd watched, confused, as he lifted the small, tarnished instrument to his lips. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then he played. It was not a lively tune. It was a slow, mournful air, a dirge that was painfully familiar to everyone in Dry Willow. It was the melody they played on the fiddle and the concertina when they buried their own. It was the tune that had been played for the men lost in the mine, for Henderson, who fell from the bridge, for all the ghosts that haunted the town's quiet corners. He played only a few bars, but each note was a memory, a shared grief, a fresh cut on an old wound. Then, as suddenly as he had begun, he stopped. He lowered the harmonica, his eyes locking onto Silas Crane's. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of 3 years of buried pain. "My brother's name, Eli," he said, the words clear and sharp as broken glass. "His name was on one of your lost insurance files, too." The connection was brutal and absolute. This was not a new crime. It was a pattern, a lifetime of profiting from the misery and the silence of others. The quiet that followed was profound. It was the silence of judgment. Silas Crane stood exposed, his lies stripped away, leaving only the ugly, greedy man beneath. The crowd stared at him, their faces hard, their eyes filled with a slow-burning, righteous fury. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing down, suffocating. Cole felt it too, but he refused to yield to it. He stepped forward and slammed his open palm down on the stone wall of the lich gate. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "No more," he said, his voice ringing with a final, unbreakable conviction. "The silence is over. We killed it." That was all it took. The dam of fear finally broke. It was the third henchman, the one with the knife who had been standing at the back of the group, who shattered. His face crumpled. A loud, ragged sob escaped his lips. "He made us do it," the man cried, pointing a trembling finger at Crane. "He told us the railroad was coming. He said if he owned all the land, he'd make us all rich. He just said to scare people off. He said no one was supposed to get hurt." The confession, blubbered and pathetic, was the final blow. The crowd surged forward, no longer a collection of individuals, but a single entity, a wave of outrage. They were not a mob bent on violence, but a community that had finally found its voice. Sheriff Harlan moved then, with a speed and decisiveness that no one had seen from him in years. He pushed through the crowd, his face set like granite. He grabbed Silas Crane by the arm, spinning him around and slamming him against the churchyard wall. Crane, for the first time in his life, looked genuinely shocked, his power utterly gone. The sheriff pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Crane," he said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." He snapped the cuffs onto Crane's wrists. The sound was not loud, but in the suddenly quiet yard, it was definitive. A sharp, clean click of metal on metal. It was the sound of a lock closing, of a debt being paid, of justice, at long last, being served. And then, a new sound began. It was the bell. Nora's daughter, Sarah, had run back to the steeple door. She was too small to pull the heavy lariat herself, but she hung on it, her small weight just enough to make the great bell swing. Her mother, Nora, ran to her side, and then another woman, and another. They took hold of the rope together. They began to pull. Bong, bong, bong. This time, no one tried to stop them. The sound was not a summons to fear, but a peal of triumph. It was the sound of freedom. It rolled out over the town, not as a sound that broke the silence, but as a voice that filled it, a strong, clear, resonant voice that chased the last of the shadows and the whispers from the corners of Dry Willow, and promised that tomorrow would be a different kind of day. The day after the storm was a day of profound quiet. It was not the old, heavy silence of fear, but a new, clean silence of exhaustion and contemplation. The world was scoured, the air smelling of wet pine and rich, dark earth. The creek, though still high and brown, had retreated within its banks, its roar subsiding to a steady, powerful murmur. Dry Willow was breathing again, a slow, deep, and steady breath. In the afternoon, the mail coach, a day late, slogged its way into town, its wheels churning through the thick mud. Its arrival was a small, normal thing, a tether to the outside world that felt both strange and reassuring. It brought supplies, old newspapers, and a single, crisp envelope for Elena Merritt. The return address was from the Union Pacific Railroad Company, Omaha, Nebraska. She took it with a sense of detachment, her mind still occupied with the monumental task of organizing the town's recovery. The settler families were preparing to move on, their wagon axle finally repaired. The townspeople were taking stock, sharing what little they had, a new sense of community forged in the crucible of the flood and the rebellion against Silas Crane. Later, in the quiet of the grain shed, with the children napping on blankets, she slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The offer inside was clear, concise, and staggering. It was a formal contract. The company had heard of her work with the survey crews and the settlers, of a cook who could make a good meal out of next to nothing and maintain order and morale through sheer force of will. They were offering her the position of head cook for a new track-laying crew heading west from Cheyenne. The salary was more than she had ever imagined earning in a year. The contract was for a guaranteed 2 years. All she had to do was sign and be in Cheyenne within the fortnight. It was an escape, a clean break, a chance to leave Dry Willow and its ghosts behind, to be defined not by a dead fiancé or a silent belle, but by a title, a salary, and a purpose. It was a future, delivered in an envelope. She sat there for a long time, the paper resting in her lap, the weight of the offered life pressing down on her. Later, as the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, weak shadows, Cole found her by the creek. She was staring at the new bridge the men of the town were hastily constructing to replace the one damaged by the flood. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time, just watching the water flow. The compensation money from Crane's accounts came through, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. The state auditors were thorough. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to repay everyone he cheated. There's some left over. He paused, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. I've been thinking, he said, the words coming slowly, as if he were assembling them piece by piece, about the grain shed, about the kids, about the travelers who passed through with nothing but dust in their pockets. He looked at her then, his gaze direct. I was thinking we could use that money to buy the shed from the bank, properly, reinforce the walls, put in a real floor, build a proper brick oven, a long table where folks can eat, shelves for books, for the school, for anyone who wants to read. His vision was simple and powerful, a place that's a kitchen and a library and a school, all under one roof, a place for anyone who's hungry, for food or for knowledge, a place to rest. It was a beautiful idea. It was a dream that perfectly melded her skills with his, her passions with his sense of justice. It was a future, right here in Dry Willow. And a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She looked away from him, back at the rushing water. Samuel had promised her a future, a house he would build for her, a life he would provide for her. He was a good man, but she would have been a part of his life, living in his house. Cole was a different man entirely. But here he was, presenting her with another fully formed plan, a beautiful dream that he had built in his own mind. Was she to be just a part of his dream? Too. The cook in his kitchen library, the teacher in his school a shadow, however beloved, cast by the strong figure of a man who made the decisions. It's a fine idea. Cole, she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the creek. It's your idea. He heard the reservation in her tone, the subtle distance she had put between them. He looked at her, at the way she held herself, her shoulders squared, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He didn't understand the source of her fear, not fully, but he understood that she was pulling away. He could have argued. He could have tried to persuade her, to tell her it was their idea, but he had learned something in the last few days about the power of actions over words. He turned and walked away without another word. She watched him go. a hollow ache in her chest. She had hurt him. She had pushed him away. But how could she explain a fear she barely understood herself? He disappeared into the livery stable, and she was left alone with the sound of the water and the weight of two possible futures. A few minutes later, he returned. In his hand, he carried his hammer, the one with the new leather grip. He walked up to her, his expression serious, his eyes holding hers. He didn't speak. He simply held out the hammer to her. She looked from the hammer to his face, confused. "What's this for? They're about to set the last post for the bridge support," he said, his voice even. "It's the cornerstone, the piece that holds it all together." He pushed the hammer gently into her hands. Its weight was solid, real, the leather grip still molded to the shape of his grasp. "You drive the last post. Elena, this place, this town, it's as much yours as it is mine. Maybe more. You build it how you see fit." And with that simple gesture, he demolished the wall of her fear. He wasn't offering her a place in his dream. He was handing her the tools to build her own, and promising to stand beside her while she did it. He was giving her not just a future, but the power to create it. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She clutched the hammer, its solidness an anchor in the swirling sea of her emotions. She could only nod, unable to speak. Later that day, another voice gave her a reason to stay. Sheriff Harlan, his badge now polished, his uniform brushed, stopped her in the street. He carried himself differently now, with a straight-backed authority that was no longer just about keeping things quiet. The state had formally appointed him to lead the expanded investigation into Crane's affairs, and the responsibility had settled on him like a mantle. "Miss Merritt," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I know you have family back east. I know you have options." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Those children." He nodded towards the grain shed. "They've learned more than just their letters from you. They've learned to speak up. This whole town has—" He met her eyes, and she saw in them a profound and weary respect. Dry Willow needs the bell you rang. It needs the hand that rang it. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of her place in the new order of things. The final piece fell into place just before dusk. She saw the children gathered outside the grain shed. They were erecting a new sign. It was not the temporary, chipped slate. This was a solid plank of wood, scavenged from the flood debris. On it, painted in fresh, clean white paint, was one word: tomorrow. The letters were more even this time, the strokes more confident. They were building the future with their own hands, a future she had shown them was possible. She went back to her small room in the wagon camp. The settlers would be leaving in the morning. She took out the letter from the railroad company, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the rough-hewn reality of the town. She opened it, reading the words one last time. It was a good offer, a safe offer, a life of predictable work and steady pay. Through the open window, a new smell drifted on the evening air. It was the scent of baking cornbread, not from her open cook fire, but from the brick oven behind the general store. An oven that had been cold for years, but which Nora had fired up to bake bread for the whole town. It was the smell of permanence, the smell of a community putting down roots again. She looked out the window. In the large paddock behind the livery, Cole was working. He wasn't breaking a wild horse or doing anything dramatic. He was patiently leading Nora's young calves, one by one, across a single plank laid over a muddy ditch. He was teaching them not to be afraid, showing them that a bridge was a safe way to cross to the other side. His movements were slow, calm, and infinitely patient. He was rebuilding trust, one small step at a time. Elena looked from the man in the paddock to the letter in her hand. One was a promise of a journey, of constant movement, of leaving things behind. The other was a promise of building something, of patient work, of putting down roots. Slowly, she folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the quiet room, "is big enough for me right here." As she made her choice, the sun, which had been hidden behind the mountains, finally crested the peaks. Its first rays struck the main street, turning the lingering damp mud from a dull brown to a path of glittering gold. The whole town seemed to sigh, to take a deep, collective breath, and to turn its face towards the new light. A few seasons had turned, painting the cottonwoods by the creek first gold, then leaving them skeletal against the winter sky, and finally coaxing them back to a tentative green. The grain shed was no longer a place of dust and ghosts. It now had a proper wooden porch, wide and welcoming, with a railing smooth to the touch. Above the door, a new sign hung from 2 wrought iron hooks, its letters carved deep into a plank of weathered pine and painted a clean, bright white kitchen library by the bell. Inside, the space had been transformed. The scent of old chaff had been replaced by the clean, sharp smell of new lumber, the comforting aroma of baking bread, and the faint, papery perfume of old books. A long, sturdy table, built by the town's men from salvaged timber, ran down the center of the room. By day, it was a school desk, its surface scarred with the first clumsy attempts at letters and numbers. By night, it was a communal dining table, a place for shared meals and quiet conversation. One entire wall was lined with shelves, also built by hand. A few dozen books donated, scavenged, or purchased with the last of the compensation money stood in neat rows, their spines a patchwork of faded colors. It was a humble collection, but for Dry Willow, it was a treasure beyond measure. As the sun dipped below the western mesas, casting the town in a soft, golden light, the bell rang. It was the third and final toll of the day. The first, at sunrise, was a call to work, a gentle rousing from sleep. The second, at noon, marked a pause for a midday meal. This third bell, at dusk, was a call to rest, to community. It signaled the end of the children's lessons and the beginning of the evening meal, a time for the town to gather. The sound of the bell brought the children tumbling out of the library's door, their laughter a new kind of music in the town square. It brought men in from the outlying ranches and women from their kitchens, each carrying a bowl or a platter to add to the communal table. This was the new rhythm of Dry Willow, a rhythm measured not by silence, but by the steady, reassuring voice of the bell. Cole and Elena stood on the porch, watching the town come together. The frantic energy of the past months, the trials, the rebuilding, the planning had settled into a steady, purposeful routine. Cole looked different. The haunted, guarded expression was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The dust of the long trail had been washed away, leaving a man who was, at last, home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of cloth. It was the handkerchief she had used to wrap his bloody knuckles on the day of the storm, the day of the fence post. He had kept it all this time. Now, it was clean, the fabric soft and worn. He handed it to her. She unfolded it. In the center of the handkerchief, stitched in a simple, slightly uneven line of dark blue thread, was a single word, tomorrow. Her stitches were not perfect. The M was a little lopsided, the final W slightly crooked, but the imperfection made it real, a testament to the fact that it had been made by a human hand, not a machine. It was a promise she had stitched for herself, and now he was returning it to her, a shared oath. She smiled, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. She looked from the handkerchief to the wall beside the door. There, on 2 large iron hooks, hung a collection of tools, shovels, saws, hammers for anyone in the town to use. She took Cole's hammer, the one with the new leather grip, from his belt loop. She walked to the wall and hung it on an empty hook. Right next to it, on display like a museum piece, was the small, rust-pitted handsaw that Jeb had used to cut the bell rope. The sheriff had insisted it be kept, a reminder of what silence had cost them. Now, the 2 objects hung side by side, the tool that had been used to enforce a false, brittle peace, and the tool that had been used to build a real, enduring one. 2 different kinds of tomorrow, one a relic, the other a promise. When she turned back, Cole was standing closer than she had expected. The space between them was filled with the sense of their new life, the warm, yeasty smell of Nora's bread, the faint, clean smell of the horse leather on his belt. and the dry, sweet smell of the books that filled the shelves behind them. It was the smell of their two worlds, no longer separate, but woven together into a single, complex whole. A playful glint appeared in her eyes. She leaned in, her voice a low, intimate murmur that was just for him. "Deeper," she whispered, the single word a callback to her desperate cry at the fence line, a moment that could have been a source of shame and scandal, but which they had transformed into their own private joke, a symbol of their beginning. She smiled, a slow, beautiful curve of her lips. Deeper, into a real life. Cole's answering smile was slow and certain. He gently shook his head. "No more one last time. Elena," he said, his voice as soft as hers. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "From now on, one strike at a time, together." It was not the flowery promise of a fairy tale. It was the solid, unvarnished pledge of a partner. It was the promise of shared labor, of patient work, of a life built not in a single, desperate act, but in 1,000 small, steady ones. He drew her closer, and under the long shadow cast by the church steeple, in the gentle glow of the oil lamps being lit on the porch, he kissed her. It was not a hesitant, stolen kiss in the shadows. It was an open, unhurried, and deeply certain act, offered and accepted in the heart of the town they had helped to save. There were no whispers from onlookers, no smirking glances. The townspeople who saw it simply smiled, a quiet, knowing approval. The age of the rumor was over. They stood there, not as a cowboy and a schoolteacher, but as two people who had found their foundation. Their breathing was even and calm, a shared, quiet rhythm, steady and sure as the fall of a hammer, across the square, leaning against a veranda post. Sheriff Harlan watched. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips. He pushed himself off the post and walked to the base of the church steeple. Nailed to the wood was a faded, weather-beaten sign, its letters barely legible, "By order no bell ringing." It was a relic of the old law, the law of silence. He took a crowbar from his office and, with two sharp, decisive movements, pried the sign from the wall. He didn't just toss it aside. He carried it to the communal fire pit where the evening meal was being prepared. He bent the old, brittle wood over his knee, snapping it in two, and then he laid the pieces on the fire. The flames licked at the old, dry paint, and the words that had enforced years of fear curled into black ash and disappeared into the evening sky. Dry Willow was alive. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the porch of the library. The rhythmic thump of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from the end of the street. The lowing of cattle settled for the night was a peaceful, pastoral song. The silence was no longer the law. Truth and the quiet, steady work of love were the things that now held the town upright. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would be honored if you'd let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all share in this experience together. If you enjoyed our tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, please hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.